You're watching BBC Newsroom Live. It's 11 a.m. and these are the main stories this morning. There'll be no visas for low-skilled and low-paid workers as the government unveils plans for a points-based immigration system.
This basically redefines our immigration policy. So the brightest and the best, people with skills need to come to the UK.
This policy is going to turn into a muddle, and yet it sends a very clear message that immigration is a bad thing.
Hello, a very good morning to you and welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. I'm Anita McVeigh. Low-skilled migrant workers seeking employment in the UK will not be able to get a visa under the government's new plans for a points-based immigration system. Ministers say employers must move away from a reliance on cheap labour from Europe and invest in technology. The scheme, which comes into force next January, will apply equally to citizens from inside and outside the EU. The new system is about points, and people who want to come here will need at least 70 to apply. So how do those points break down? Well, having a job offer before you apply will get you 20 points. You will also get a further 20 points if that job is deemed to be at an appropriate skill level. An additional 20 points will be awarded if you have a salary of £25,000 or work in a sector where there's a labour shortage. And speaking English will also be a requirement. That will earn you 10 points. But there'll be no entry to the UK for most people doing what are classed as lower skilled work in restaurants, care homes or food processing plants. Let's speak now to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, joining us from Westminster. So, Norman, how much control do you think this new points-based system will actually give the government over immigration?
Well, I think the honest answer is we don't know, because it's an evolving system. We have the outlines of it. And in a way, I think what we get today is a moment when the sort of Brexit big picture meets the Brexit nitty-gritty detail, because on the big picture, I think the government will be fairly comfortable that the proposals today will strike a chord with many people, because they are ending freedom of movement, they are ending low-skilled EU immigration into this country, they are insisting that migrants speak English. All of that, I suspect, will prove popular. The difficulty comes in the detail, particularly in relation to business and how business is going to cope with this new system, which is coming in very fast indeed. It's due to be in place by January the 1st next year. But business say they will have to have their new systems for sponsoring skilled workers, applying for visas, paying for them, have to have all that in place by the summer. So just months away. But the much bigger headache is for those businesses which are heavily reliant on low-skilled EU workers. And there are a lot of them. You're talking about food processing, you're talking about hospitality, you're talking about retail, you're talking about construction, and you're talking about care workers. The government's response, at least Priti Patel's response, has been to say, look, there are 8 million economically inactive people in the UK. Companies can recruit from them. The difficulty with that is the 8 million figure is made up overwhelmingly of the long-term sick, the retired, students, carers, parents. In other words, the 8 million are not an available pool pool of labour for business to recruit from. And the CBI and others are saying, look, actually, we are pretty close to full employment, which means some sectors, they fear, are facing the possibility of closure and companies simply being unable to operate under this new system.
Let's develop that thought, Norman, because the government is saying that employers will need to adjust. How challenging is this actually going to be for employers, particularly in certain sectors? And what has the reaction been so far?
Well, I have to say the reaction from the government so far has been pretty much business, get on with it. It's about time you invested in UK staff. You need to invest more in automation and technology. You need to start developing better career structures for people joining, particularly younger workers. In other words, you need to get your act together. You've had it easy for far too long. The difficulty is if you are a business and you're having to manage a company, to implement those sort of changes in a very short period of time is extraordinarily challenging. Nowhere more so, you have to say, than in the care sector, where they already estimate they have around 120,000 vacancies. And that's with the availability of EU staff, which is no longer going to be so readily available. And representatives for the care industry are pretty clear in saying that they fear this will mean more care homes are going to have to close. And why this matters even more politically is because Boris Johnson has said he will come forward with a plan for resolving the difficulties in social care this year, and he will resolve the social care crisis within this Parliament. It's hard to see how that is going to be possible if the social care sector finds itself under even more pressure in terms of staffing and recruitment.
OK, Norman, thank you very much. Norman Smith. And let's get reaction now from Stuart MacDonald, the SNP MP. He joins us from Glasgow. A very good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks very much.
Nicola Sturgeon, your party leader, saying this morning it's impossible to overstate how devastating this UK government policy will be for Scotland's economy. What are your chief concerns?
Well, first of all, there are specific industries which will be devastated by these proposals. For example, we've heard about the social care industry, but also tourism, hospitality, food and drink, agriculture. All of these industries are really going to struggle. It's quite disgraceful, actually, for the Home Secretary to take 3.5 years to come up with proposals that she then gives these industries just 3 or 4 months to try and implement. But going beyond that, it's also about broader demographic and population concerns. We have only just become a country that has net in-migration and a growing population, and that's entirely thanks to freedom of movement, which is coming to an end. So the real risk for Scotland now is that our population as a whole, and our working age population in particular, goes into decline, and that is bad for everybody, for taxpayers, for business and for the public finances.
So are you saying that even if everyone in Scotland able to be economically active was in employment, that wouldn't be enough to fill the jobs? Because Priti Patel is talking about across the UK this bank of 8 million people who employers can call upon.
Well, it's just wholly unrealistic, as your assistant political editor just explained. I mean, employment is at near record levels in Scotland as it stands, and it's similar in other parts of the United Kingdom as well. So the idea that you can suddenly replace really quality, dedicated social care workers, people working in tourism and hospitality, with folk who haven't been able to get a job because of ill health or injury is absolutely ridiculous and a disgraceful idea.
I was listening to an interview with a small business owner earlier who was saying that businesses have relied for a long time on the low-wage economy, on the fact that there would be staff out there if there was a high turnover of staff. Do you think that there is something in this for workers, for employees, in that it might encourage employers to really value them more, to train them up, to do something that will want them to stay with the business?
I'm very sceptical. I mean, the government's own Migration Advisory Committee concluded that there was next to no evidence at all, for example, that migration has any impact on wages. I'm all for improving employee rights and labour conditions, but you do that through improving the minimum wage, improving their rights at work. You don't do it by suddenly turning your back on talented and able workers, like social care workers, the folk who operate in our tourism and hospitality industries and construction and so on. And it's actually quite disgraceful to sort of speak of these people as if they are cheap, unskilled labour. Many of them are actually very talented and very able and are making an immense contribution. So I'm very sceptical that there are any benefits for anyone out of these proposals.
OK, Stuart MacDonald, MP from the SNP, thank you very much for your time. And if you've got a question about how the new immigration rules will affect you or your business, do get in touch. We're going to try to answer as many of your questions as possible at 3:30 this afternoon. You can see the ways to do that on the screen using the hashtag BBC Ask This. You can also text 61124 and you can email askthis@bbc.co.uk or tweet, as we've already mentioned, using the hashtag BBC Ask This. Let's return to our top story today, those new plans for a points-based immigration system that means low-skilled migrant workers seeking employment in the UK will not be able to get a visa. The government's new scheme, which comes into force next January, will apply equally to citizens from inside and outside the EU. Let's get the reaction now of Labour's Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary John Ashworth, who's in Leicester now. A very good morning to you. And we know that from the reaction from this sector already, there are deep concerns about whether vacancies can be filled and whether the sector can actually run effectively with this points-based system. But Priti Patel this morning talking about a bank of people out there. She's quoting a figure of 8 million whom employers can call upon. Now, I can see from your reaction that you don't set much store by that.
I mean, she's clearly clueless, isn't she? I mean, not only are these proposals hugely damaging for our economy, making a complete mockery of Tory claims to level up our economy, they're potentially devastating for our health and care sector. Our NHS and our social care sector has always relied on international recruitment, and although there may well be exemptions for certain categories of NHS staff, it seems there'll be no exemptions whatsoever for social care staff. Now, at the moment, there's around 250,000 staff working in our social care sector we've recruited internationally, and we also have vacancies for 122,000 staff in social care. Now, if we cannot find those staff in social care and these new immigration rules exacerbate the vacancies in social care, that will mean many elderly people, perhaps your grandma, or maybe not yours in particular, but the viewers' grandmas or aunties, waiting even longer in hospital because they cannot be discharged from the hospital. It means many elderly and vulnerable people out in the community not getting the support that they deserve. So these policies will detrimentally impact on the lives of some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
The government is saying it's up to businesses, employers to adapt. I mean, frankly, do you think that there are enough Britons out there who actually want to do those kinds of jobs? And if there were, could they then learn the skills, the necessary skills to take on these jobs?
I'm afraid the government simply don't have a clue about the realities on the ground. The social care sector has vacancies for 122,000 staff as things stand. That's today. This is a sector which is already struggling, a sector which has been left reeling by multi-billion-pound cuts under the Conservatives. Now, of course, if the sector wants to increase wages, wants to invest staff to recruit more people to work in it, then it needs the funds to do that. But the government are not prepared to put the funding into the social care sector. And what this will mean is that elderly people, or perhaps adults with disabilities, will lose out on the specialist care that they need to stay in their homes and live more fulsome lives, or it will mean elderly people trapped in hospitals because there is nowhere for them to go in the community. We all know what a crisis our NHS is in, with many elderly people left languishing on trolleys for hours upon hours. These problems will get even worse because of the immigration proposals that Boris Johnson is putting forward today.
Clearly, there are some very specific and special concerns around that sector. But more broadly, as a party, do you think this might encourage employers in other sectors to put up wages, to invest more in staff in order to retain them? And wouldn't that be a good thing in Labour's view?
Well, obviously, we want employers to pay better wages. It's why in our manifesto that we fought the 2019 general election on, we were talking about a living wage, we were talking about investing in skills, we were talking about rebalancing the economy. That's obviously a good thing. But remember, we have an economy at the moment where there are high levels of employment and many sectors face huge vacancy rates, particularly the social care sector. They will not be able to survive unless they are able to recruit internationally. And I've got to say, I think there's something rather offensive about describing our social care workers who care for our elderly, who care for adults with disabilities, as low skill. This is a highly skilled job, but the government, by putting them in this category as low skill, is not only offending people and offending lots of people who work in the sector, it's actually going to make the problems in the sector even worse. It doesn't make any sense. It suggests to me that the government either don't care about some of the most vulnerable in society or don't understand the issues on the ground.
OK, John Ashworth, Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary. Good to get your views on that this morning. Thank you very much for your time. Let's talk now to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, in Westminster. Norman, the government coming in for some heavy criticism in all of this, not just from other political parties, as one might expect, but from various interested parties in business, the social care sector and so on, with some saying there will need to be exemptions.
I think it's true to say many in business are deeply alarmed by the package unveiled today, not just because of the timescale. They're suggesting that they will have to have in place new systems to apply for visas and for sponsoring skilled workers by the summer. But the bigger alarm is in those sectors heavily dependent on low-skilled EU workers. And there are a lot of affected industries. So you mentioned care, but there's also retail, hospitality, construction, food processing. I mean, it goes on and on. And the big question mark is, what are they to do? And the response of the government has been, frankly, a pretty blunt one, which is, well, you've had it easy for far too long. You have relied much too heavily on cheap EU labour. Now you are going to have to recruit and train British workers. Indeed, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, said she thought it was, quote, a fantastic opportunity for British companies to join the government in levelling up the country. And she suggested that there were 8 million economically inactive citizens in Britain. These are based on the latest official ONS figures. 8 million economically inactive citizens who companies could recruit. Now that, frankly, has prompted incredulity and ridicule from many in business and the opposition parties who say, hang on a sec, that 8 million figure is mostly made up of the long-term sick, students, the retired, carers. In other words, these are not some 8 million people sitting around waiting to work. And the fear of many in the business community is actually we are at near full employment and there simply isn't that available pool of British workers to take on if they are deprived of access to EU staff.
And is the government putting any figures on this? We know there's a difficult history for the government when it comes to talking about targets for reducing immigration, but have they put any figures on any of this?
No, they have conspicuously and deliberately avoided putting targets. No surprise, let's be honest, because Theresa May and David Cameron had their figures of the tens of thousands. And what happened? Well, the numbers just went up and up and up and in the wrong direction. And every month the figures came out, it all proved deeply embarrassing. So Boris Johnson clearly doesn't want to repeat that. Instead, he has just said over time, there will be a reduction in overall levels of immigration. I have to say, we'll have to see, because while it is absolutely true that low-skilled immigration, the drawbridge is pretty much being pulled up, on skilled immigration, the pathway is actually being made easier. So there is no cap on skilled immigration from anywhere in the rest of the world. The salary threshold has actually been lowered from 30,000 to 25,000, and the skills threshold has also been lowered from the equivalent of a graduate degree to A-level. Now, what that means actually is for many skilled workers outside of the EU coming to Britain will be much easier. So it's quite possible you will see a rise in skilled immigration into the UK.
OK, Norman, thank you very much. Let's get reaction to all of this from Toby Williams, who's the chairman of the Kent National Farmers Union. Toby, thank you very much for joining us. So are your members ready to recruit and train British workers, in places like Kent, a key region for fruit growing, for example? Because, the National Farmers Union is saying in 2017, of the 60,000 seasonal workers picking fruit and vegetables, barely 1% was British.
Well, that's quite right. And that begs the question, is there the available labour here in our indigenous labour pool to actually supply the number of vacancies? We would argue not. What the NFU are calling on is for the government to commit to and step up to the 70,000 places needed on the seasonal agricultural workers scheme.
So do you think it's that there aren't enough workers here available to work, or simply that they don't want to do these particular jobs?
Well, I think there could be a bit of both. As in your piece, it said that we've got record low unemployment at the moment. So you have to ask, are those people and the correct people there to do that work? Where are these people who are waiting for jobs to just come out onto farms and do the harvesting and the seasonal work that's required? That's the other key thing, is that a lot of these jobs are seasonal, so they're around for a few months, perhaps 3 to 6 months in the year. They're not a full-time job, full-time as in 12 months of the year. So does that suit someone living in our economy here?
And are you concerned that the government is saying that there will be a special scheme to ensure there are enough agricultural workers? What are your concerns about that? Do you not think that is going to give you enough certainty, enough guarantee of the people to come in and pick these crops?
Well, we need certainty to do that, because to grow the crop, you've got to be sure that you can harvest it. So we're talking about 70,000 places required by 2021 on the seasonal agricultural worker scheme. We need the government to commit to that and to not tie it just to fruit and veg. It needs to be open to all horticultural businesses, whether they be ornamental producers producing flowers, the new viticulture sector for growing grapes, etc., etc. It's got to be open and allowed that the people recruiting the workers can be direct recruiters, as in employers, and through labour providers as well.
So are you saying that there are some farmers who might decide not to, at least in the short term, grow some crops and basically spend the money on the outlay for planting those crops if they think they won't be able to harvest them?
Well, that's quite right. You've got a big capital investment, so anything like this that sort of puts some ambiguity on whether you'll be able to have enough staff to harvest what you've grown could stop capital investment that's happening now, because it's not just a 5-minute job with farming. You're talking about investment that's then is put in place for a number of years. So really, you need a certainty that you can get those staff there to do the harvesting.
So ultimately, could that lead to the UK being more reliant on imports from elsewhere, from the EU?
Well, that could do. As you said, if you can't harvest the stuff, how do we get it from the plant or the tree or whatever through to the consumer? It's got to be harvested and taken there. The government have mentioned about automation. That is, there is work being done on that, but it's not going to be here in 5 minutes' time, or even you're talking 10 years out probably. So that's not going to be a complete panacea. So I really think that we need, they've got to, this short time frame thing, they've got to commit to the 70,000 that we need for this sector. They've talked about 10,000. That's not enough. We need commitment to carry on with investment.
OK, Toby Williams, Chairman of the Kent National Farmers Union. Good to get your thoughts on that story today. And if you've got a question about how the new immigration rules will affect you or your business, do get in touch, because we're going to be trying to answer as many of those as we can at 3:30. We're really keen for you to get in touch with us with your questions on Twitter using the hashtag BBC Your Questions. You can also email us on yourquestions@bbc.co.uk. More now on our top story and the government's plans for the post-Brexit immigration system. Let's head back to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, at Westminster for more reaction.
Nita, thanks very much indeed. Well, MPs have been mulling over the paper produced by the government today on this new points-based immigration system. Of course, long promised, the detail absolutely crucial. Good deal of unease has to be said amongst sections of the business community, particularly those which are heavily reliant on cheaper EU labour. Well, let's talk to the Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood. From what you've seen so far, do you think the concerns of business are serious?
We absolutely must listen to businesses. Ultimately, that's what we need to do here. The focus is in making sure that we have the UK skill sets to take us into the future. The world's getting more competitive. Productivity in the UK is not what it should be. We're behind countries such as Germany and so forth. So we need to invest in technology and invest in UK skills. We can't continue to rely on the cheap EU labour, and also we can't continue to grow this the size of the UK by about 200,000 every single year. There was a mandate in the last 3 elections that we had to get a grasp of this. You're never going to get a perfect scenario here, but this is a vision to say, let's have a better understanding of who comes in. But you make a strong point. We must listen to those, the employers, the business communities, to make sure we get the right skill sets for this country.
What about the speed at which this is being implemented? The business community say if they are to apply for visas and to sponsor skilled workers, they'll have to start putting procedures in place this summer. In other words, they've only got months to do this. They want more time.
Well, let's not forget, we're not throwing anybody out. So anybody that's working here now continues to work here. We're not reducing the size of the workforce that comes in from abroad. What we're doing is making sure that from January next year that we start a new process of having a controlled environment, which again is what I think was called for in the last 3 elections itself.
Those sectors which are heavily dependent on cheap EU labour say, well, it sounds fine in theory, but the bottom line is there is not a large pool of unemployed workers they can replace those EU staff with. So what happens in sectors like hospitality or the care sector?
Well, we need to make sure we invest in the British people. There's about 2 million people who are economically inactive. And we went through a phase, I'm afraid, under Labour, where the benefits budget went from about 60 billion, it doubled to 120 billion. It became easier to live on benefits. That became a lifestyle choice. And we're saying no to that. We need to make sure that we encourage people to work. So yes, of course, there's going to be a transition period, and we must again listen to our employers to make sure that happens. But don't forget, there will be some exemptions, not least in nursing and so forth, where visas will be expedited. When it comes to the seasonal fruit picking and so forth, there'll be exemptions there as well. But I suspect that this announcement will go through, legislation will pass. We'll come back and tweak this as it advances. I hope that's the case. Tobias Ellwood, thanks very much for your time. A lot of the devil, of course, is going to be in the detail, but the government have said that this is going to be an evolving scheme and that they will look at setting aside some sectors where there are particular shortages, and they will seek to modify the scheme if there are areas where there are real pressures on sectors of the British economy.
Thank you for that. And let me remind you that if you've got a question about how the new immigration rules will affect you or your business, you can get in touch with us, because we're going to be trying to answer as many of those questions as possible at 3:30 this afternoon, when we'll be joined by Dennis Kieran's from the Migration Observatory at Oxford University. We're really keen for you to get in touch with us with your questions on Twitter. You can use that hashtag on your screen, BBC Your Questions. You can also email us on yourquestions@bbc.co.uk.
Well, let's assess the scheme, the reaction, how it might work. Let's talk first of all to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, following this at Westminster. And in terms of what we know so far anyway, Norman, not perhaps what people might have been expecting.
Well, there's been a very uneasy reaction, I would say, from many in the business community at the pace at which these changes are being introduced, but above all from those sectors which have been traditionally heavily reliant on cheaper labour from the EU. So sectors such as the care sector, construction, hospitality, who fear that they simply will not be able to get the staff that they need. What has been striking, though, is the response from ministers has been a pretty uncompromising one. They've almost, it seems to me, given business a sort of finger wagging, saying to them, look, you've relied for far too long on cheap EU labour. Now you are going to have to recruit and train British labour. Indeed, The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, said she thought this new system would be, quote, a fantastic opportunity for British business to take part in levelling up the country. And to compound that sort of finger wagging, she also suggested there were 8 million economically inactive people in the UK whom British business could recruit from. Now, that has caused amazement amongst many in the business community, because those official figures are primarily made up of students, the retired, carers, the long-term sick. In other words, they are not a pool of people sitting around to be recruited. So in the business community, I think there is still considerable anxiety about these changes.
Yes, Norman, thank you for now. Let's also talk to our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw. And in terms of immigration, does this do, could it do what the government wants to achieve that is so often talked about?
Well, the government is quite clear in its document. It says overall levels of migration will reduce, but they don't say what timescale or by how much. There are no details about that at all. When you look at the proposals, you can see how that could happen, because the supply of EU labour will undoubtedly fall under these plans. But on the other hand, there's a liberalisation for people coming from outside Europe, because the restrictions on skilled work have been eased a bit. There's no cap on skilled labour. So you could see some increases in areas there as well. I think the pinch point will come with this unskilled or this lower skilled issue, whereby there's no clear route in for lower skilled workers. There is a seasonal agricultural scheme for fruit pickers. There is a youth mobility scheme for young people to come and do work. And foreign students can stay on for an extra 2 years after they've graduated. But very interestingly, the government in December 2018, when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary, produced an immigration white paper which gave a 12-month visa for lower skilled workers to come here. 12 months, because they understood that there would be problems for the care sector and for the construction sector. That idea has gone completely. There's no visa at all for that whatsoever. It'll be very interesting to see in the months to come, once this system beds down, whether or not the government have to reverse.
All right, Danny, thank you very much. Danny Shaw. Very good afternoon. You are watching BBC News. I'm Jane Hill. We'll talk a little bit more about our main stories this lunchtime. And migrants who are low-skilled or low-paid won't be able to get a work visa under the government's plans for a new points-based immigration system. The scheme will apply equally to people from inside and outside the EU from next January, after the end of the Brexit transition period. Many industries, including the care and hospitality sectors, have warned that the government's points-based system could have damaging consequences for the economy. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, has more from Westminster.
Well, it seems the government's new points-based immigration system has good news and bad news for business. The good news is that recruiting skilled workers looks as if it's going to become easier. Recruiting low-skilled workers is going to become nigh on impossible for many businesses, and it's going to pose huge problems, it seems, for those who rely heavily on recruiting low-skilled workers from the EU. The government's response is to say, well, don't worry, you can now recruit British workers. Well, joining me is the Director General of the CBI, Carolyn Fairbairn. And what's wrong with that? Why don't companies simply recruit from home?
Well, companies do recruit from home, but we have record employment rates in this country at the moment, and we have widespread skill shortages. So, yes, the government, I think, has moved a long way in terms of higher skilled, higher paid roles, and that's very welcome, taking the cap off skilled visas, also reducing the cap from £30,000 to more like £25,000 is very welcome. But there will be some sectors that will be worrying about how they are going to recruit at all skill levels. The care sector, the construction sector, the hospitality sector, and that is a real concern.
How serious are their concerns, and to what extent is this just crying wolf?
Well, I think you just have to look at the employment rates in this country. We just had the latest figures, and the economy is very, very good at creating jobs at the moment. And I think this is going to be serious for sectors where they do have a lot of lower paid roles that are nonetheless very important to our economy. The care sector. We have a care crisis in this country. There are 100,000 vacancies as we speak in the care sector, and those workers will no longer be eligible to enter the country from abroad. I think that is a very serious concern. I would also cite the construction sector, where we want a construction revolution, an infrastructure revolution in this country, and many of the trades, the plumbing, the electricians, the core construction workers, again, will not be eligible. These are real concerns, and at the very least, I think what business will be hoping for is time to adapt to what is a very large change in our immigration system.
Well, the government has said they want this new system to be in force by January the 1st next year. Is that possible?
I think that timing is very tight. Obviously, business will do what it can to help. But if you think that if you are a business now wanting to recruit for this time next year, you'd be having to have your offers out by July. That is very, very soon. We don't know what the systems are going to be, so that creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern for particularly smaller businesses who don't have the head offices and the back offices to be able to do all of this. They are extremely concerned that they won't be able to continue to operate their businesses as effectively next year.
And what do you say to those who might argue that business have had it easy for too long? You've been able to simply rely on cheap EU labour rather than investing in workers here.
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that business absolutely understands that investing in the workforce here has to go hand in hand. It is hugely important with anything around immigration internationally. But I think I would point out that the government's own Migration Advisory Committee has said that migration has had virtually no effect on wages in this country. Actually, what we do have, though, is skill shortages across some very key sectors for our future economic growth, from care to hospitality to construction. Building a system that builds public trust is hugely important. Business completely understands that freedom of movement is ending and supports that. But we also need to be implementing a system that works for the economy and enables us to continue to grow. Hence, businesses' request for time to adapt and actually ensuring that for SMEs, smaller businesses in particular, the costs are not too onerous.
And what do you think could be the impact on the economy if companies maybe can't expand because they can't recruit the staff they need?
Well, I think it very much depends on how this is implemented now. And I think our message to government is we understand what you're trying to do. We really appreciate the moves that have been made on skilled people and also on lowering the cap. Now let's get the implementation right. Let's get this right on day one. It would be very important for our global reputation as an open economy. So get the implementation right. Don't rush it. Get the systems right. Allow small firms in particular the time to adapt and pay particular attention to some of those sectors most exposed, like the care sector, like the construction sector, that are so important to our future economy.
And do you think you're being listened to? Because you've now got a system which is being introduced pretty quickly. You've also been told more broadly that we are going to face additional checks and regulations when we trade with the EU. Is business actually being listened to by the government?
Well, I think actually the government has been thoughtful on the immigration policy, and we do see some very welcome steps that have been taken in response to requests from business. For example, the £30,000 salary cap is now £25,000 600, and we also have seen a lifting of the cap on skilled visas and a 2-year post-study visa for students. These are all things that business has asked for, government has listened, and government has responded. Now I think what business is saying is we understand where you're heading, we understand the points-based system, we can make it work, but allow enough time to adapt, recognise where there are going to be particular strains in the economy, that some of these sectors that are so important for caring for our ageing population or building our railways and our homes will need special consideration.
Carolyn Fairbairn, thanks very much indeed. Well, The devil, as always, is going to be in the detail, and the government is stressing this is going to be a system which is going to evolve. So we shall have to see how this new points-based system does indeed evolve.
Yes, Norman Smith there at Westminster. We're going to be talking about this all afternoon, of course, and just worth flagging up in particular if you have questions about how this new system, as outlined today anyway, is going to work, particularly perhaps if you run your own business, do get in touch. We're going to try and answer as many questions as possible at 3:30. So send your questions in by 3:30. We'll be talking to Dennis Kierans from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Any questions you have about how it might work, Twitter, there's the hashtag BBC Your Questions, or you can email us as well, your questions at bbc.co.uk. That's coming up at just after 3:30.
And Jessica is in Westminster for us now, and well, controversial doesn't even cover it, does it?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that's emerged today is this discussion over a possible labour shortage, according to some businesses who are deeply concerned, say, if they are in the construction sector, the hospitality sector, the care sector. Where are they going to get these so-called low-skilled workers from now that that route is effectively being cut off? And one of the things that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, suggested that businesses could draw on today was around 8 million economically inactive people, she said, that are in the UK, but those figures have been examined, and that 8 million economically inactive people is made up of some people who care for their own relatives, it's made up of the long-term sick, made up of students, even people who have retired. Only around 2 million, it's thought, would actually be looking for work. So I think the government coming under a bit of pressure on that, but actually they're being pretty bullish about the whole thing, saying that businesses for a long time have relied on cheap labour from the EU. It's time to look at training up people in the UK and using technology as well and enhancing the productivity in UK businesses.
And implicit criticism of employers who they say should have been training people for longer than now.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, looking at this idea of training up people, because where are all these people going to come from? Of course, in the UK at the moment, there is near full employment. And remember, the Conservative Party likes to sell themselves as the party of business. But as I mentioned, for example, the hospitality sector, looking at these low-skilled workers as they're described, where are they going to come from? Where are they going to get waiters? Where are they going to get kitchen staff? And so I think it's a challenge for the Conservative Party. On the other side, there are actually businesses who are welcoming the more flexible system that we're going to see for so-called skilled workers. So the cap that there used to be is being lifted, the salary threshold is actually being lowered. So businesses are saying to that extent there is some good news in this system, but deep concerns remain.
Jessica, thank you very much. That's Jessica Parker in Westminster. Well, let's talk more about this. Joining me now is Sally Gilson, Head of Skills Policy at the Freight Transport Association, and Ranjit Rathore, who's from the Indian National Students Association. Thank you both for coming in. Sally, first of all, the issue here seems to be the point of skills and a definition of what is a skill.
Yeah, and I think we've got to get away from this academic labelling, because a lot of these people are not unskilled. Certainly, if you spoke to our members, their HGV drivers driving around London are highly skilled and professional drivers. So labelling them unskilled for a start is not helpful. And we've got to sort of just move away from these arbitrary thresholds that they're setting.
Priti Patel this morning seems quite bullish and says, no, this is down to employers. They need to stop relying on what has been very cheap labour for a very long time, and we need to move on and train up.
Well, what I would say to that is if they expect us to adapt and adjust, then they will also have to adapt and adjust their future skills policy, because at the moment the funding for training is just not out there unless it's purely for an apprenticeship, and that doesn't actually fit very well for our sector.
Ranjit, I mean, after months, well, years of speculation as to how any new immigration system would work, does this come with some relief for students, perhaps?
Yeah, very much so. Like, students have welcomed this new change in law with big open arms, and all the organisations such as Indian National Students Association and lots of other students' union across the countries, they were all campaigning, they were all lobbying for post-study work visa. After that, news was really positive, and after the point-based system, students are really, really positive about it, because once they come to the UK, if you're doing a STEM course, you're paying 18 grand to the university, so 1 year of your living cost accommodation.
STEM, we should explain: science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
Mathematics, yeah. It's going to cost you 30 grand a year. If you do 3 years, that's 90 grand. You know, so roughly you're paying 100 grand for 3 years to be in the UK to study, and there was no way that you can stay back and work in the UK. So this point-based system will allow people with degrees with higher skill set to work in the UK and make a living, earn a living.
And traditionally, students who've been coming from outside the EU
yes.
now know where they are,
yes.
if you like.
Yeah, indeed, yes.
Sally, what will it mean for drivers, HGV drivers now? How are they going to be thinking about what they can do? I mean, 20 points for a job offer, 20 points for a job at an appropriate skill level, 10 points if you speak English. Most would qualify, wouldn't they?
No, sadly they wouldn't, mainly because of the skill level, and we can't increase their skill level. It's a level 2 qualification. So without sort of lots of other boxes to tick, it would be incredibly difficult for businesses to be able to recruit outside of the UK in future. And I think one of the things that we forget about is that for a long time now, you've got HR departments who haven't had to deal with how to deal with a visa system. All of a sudden, their whole worlds are about to change.
But to be fair, this isn't a huge surprise. We've been talking about this for an awfully long time.
But we're in a situation at the moment of very low unemployment. Logistics hubs tend to be in areas of incredibly low unemployment. So it's not like we've all of a sudden got a resource available to us just to replace people.
That said, will there be many people in the indigenous British people who might think, well, there's going to be some jobs in HGV driving?
We've already got a 59,000 shortage of HGV drivers.
59,000?
So if anybody wanted to be a driver at the moment, we're desperate for them to start that vocation.
And yet there's Priti Patel saying there's a huge number. She says 8 million, which is clearly a figure that is way overestimating what's going on here. But they're just not there.
Yeah. And unless you want to keep shipping people around the country, and at the end of the day, you need to be able to recruit from the local area if you're sending people off for driving.
And Ranjit, in terms of students, will this encourage them also to stay?
Yes, so this will definitely encourage students to stay, because as an international student, personally speaking, when we think of UK is a developed country, and all the mostly students who come and study here, they come from a developing country. So there's a gap between developed and a developing country, and having a degree is bridging that gap, and studying in the UK is bridging that gap. And with this new point system, this will allow the students to stay here and work in the UK, get that British experience, get that British earning. For what they've invested in their education.
I just want to pick up on Sally's point about fairness, this obsession with academic ability.
Indeed.
I mean, that's something you would agree with, is it?
I'm
sorry, it's not like everybody's watching you right now for an answer, but let's have an answer. Is it unfair?
Is it unfair that people who don't...
That's how we judge people when we're talking about immigration, is we're judging them academically.
I mean, to be honest, everything has two sides to it. So one side is it's good, but on the other hand, such as the healthcare, people who want to work in the healthcare, it's not really good for them, because again, you don't have all the people in the UK who want to work in that industry. And as Sally rightfully said, there are not many people in the UK who want to get into the driving sector. So this is bad for that sector, and this is the sector that keeps us moving. This is the sector that keeps us, basically the supply chain, logistics. It keeps us alive, essentially.
Perfectly said.
And to be fair, you can leave university and you can do any job you want, and many people might want what the government describes as a low-skilled job, but a hugely rewarding job, such as one in care.
Yes, indeed, yeah. You're looking after somebody, you're looking after somebody's life, so that's a really rewarding sector. Not everybody gets into different sectors for money. People get into sector because they want to make a difference, because they want to give back to the community, and various other reasons. So classifying people as low skilled is not really a good thing to say.
What also about mentioning salary as a points incentive, because how fair is that? If you're talking about £22,000, if you earn less than that, you get no points at all. Are you already, the government will argue, well, that means we ensure we get skilled workers, their word skilled again, but it also deprives us of a huge sector of workers. We were hearing from farmers earlier about, fruit pickers.
Fruit pickers, yeah.
And that's going to be a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I really think so. That's going to be a problem because, I mean, first of all, I would like to talk about the background of this. So back in the day, or until yesterday, it was 30 grand. So you need to earn 30 grand to stay and work in the UK. But now it's come down to 25 grand. So 30 grand is basically for a graduate, who's just an undergrad degree or a master's degree. It's close to impossible to get a first job of your life, a first full-time job of your life, which is going to pay you 30 grand. So bringing that down, margin down to 25, that's really rewarding. Now, in terms of this sector which really supports all of us, such as farmers, I know a couple of my classmates, they were from Romania. They came to the UK as strawberry pickers, and that's how they made their living, and that's how they supported their education. So, yes, when I spoke to them about, before coming here today, they were like, trust me, not everybody from our community who's done in vegetable and fruit picking are very happy about this.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Very quickly, Sally, I mean, if Priti Patel was watching you now, what's the answer you want from her?
I just want her to stop labelling people in the way that they are, because it's completely unfair, and we are talking about crucial workers that look after our parents, that deliver our goods, that pick our vegetables, and they're just as important as anybody on a higher salary.
Sally Gilson from the Freight Transport Association and Ranjit Rathore, thank you both very much. Thank you. Well, with me now is Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. That's the hospitality sector's trade association. And we were hearing earlier from people saying this is going to decimate their industry. What's it going to do to yours?
I think it's going to grind our future growth plans to a halt. We were forecast to have 5% year-on-year growth and to generate 1 in 6 of net new jobs going forward. We can't see that continuing because we won't be able to provide the full service that we need to continue to grow.
And this is purely because of the low-skilled aspect of the employment that you're going to need?
It is, but it's also the fact that a lot of our workers will be part-time and the salary threshold is set at an absolute salary, so it's not prorated, which means that even though our workers, if they were working full-time, could be at that salary level, they won't be classified because it's the salary for that job. So if they prorated the salary, if they acknowledged that hospitality was a shortage occupation, that would give us some help under the points-based system, but it's this ruling out of any temporary low-skilled route.
So under your scenario, what will Britain look like in your industry in a year or two's time?
Well, unless we have some flexibility from the government on those areas that I've just touched on, I think we can see pubs and bars deciding that they will open later, taking out shifts, so they won't have breakfast and they will only open at lunchtime. We've already got hoteliers in certain parts of the country who are not offering lunch, they're not offering breakfast because they cannot staff the kitchen in order to provide that full service. So we're going to move to a more limited service hospitality offering. And for some of our markets, particularly where it's globally competitive, like London, Manchester, Liverpool, that's going to be devastating in terms of the events that we can attract and the high-level, luxury tourists that we can service.
Priti Patel says there are 8 million British workers out there, a huge pool that you can tap.
Well, economically inactive does not necessarily mean that they're able to work. 8 million people who are economically inactive includes long-term sick, it includes the retired, it includes people who are in education. But also, figures released by the government yesterday show that in Q4 of 2019, we had 800,000 vacancies in the UK economy. That's just in one quarter. And half of our members are reporting that they've got hard to fill vacancies. So the jobs are out there. We simply don't have the people in the UK to fill them, and that's partly in hospitality because we have a large proportion of our workforce will be young workers, and we have a change in the birth rate, which means 200,000 fewer 18 to 24-year-olds entering the jobs market this year that are UK born.
It was quite clear in the run-up to the referendum in 2016 that immigration was going to be a big issue, so it has proved. Can you see why the government has done what it's done?
Absolutely, and we've always supported the government's proposals to control immigration. This goes a stage further. This is not controlling, this is restricting. And in a highly developed economy, you need to have a migration policy and labour market policy that attracts, develops and retains the best talent at all skill levels and at all salary levels. And this doesn't take into account the needs of the economy as a whole. And that's where we're asking for a little bit of further flexibility and a more practical application in the detailed rules.
The message from the government is to, well, companies you represent. You've been relying on cheap labour for too long and it's time now to, well, A, train people up and pay a proper salary?
Well, our EU workers and the rest of the world workers that come, they make up a quarter of our workforce, so only 12% of our workforce is an EU worker. Many of them are highly skilled. They're restaurant managers, they're hotel managers, they're chefs. And we haven't been relying upon cheap foreign labour. We recruit locally. We've grown and we've generated 1 in 6 of all new jobs since the financial crash. And that growth means that we've needed to recruit more workers. And unless we have access to that labour, then we won't be able to continue to regenerate our high streets, to invest in local communities and to support the infrastructure developments across the north that the government wants us to play our part in levelling up.
I'm sure the viewers picked it up as well. You're pretty frustrated about this.
Yes, because I think there's a danger that with just 9 months to go, we are rushing into something that will restrict our economy when this is part of the economy, hospitality and tourism. Tourism is a huge export earner. This is a part of the economy that should be delivering and unleashing our potential, and we're going to be held back.
Kate, it's good to see you. Kate Nichols, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, Neil O'Brien is the Conservative MP for Harborough. He's in our studio in Leicester. We've just had a very clear message on some of the problems raised. Is that a message you share?
Well, I think there are two different types of employers out there. There are some who have chosen to invest in their workforce, to invest in equipment and to pay higher wages. And then there are other employers, unfortunately, who have chosen to rely very heavily on low-wage labour, low-skilled labour from overseas. And we have to change that. It's very clear that the government are delivering what people voted for, not just in the election, but also in the referendum of 2016. People wanted to see immigration brought under control and also the total amount reduced.
But do you
so by moving to an Australian-style points-based system, then we are doing that. We will continue to have immigration, high-skill immigration from other countries, but we are going to reduce the flow of really low-skill migration from Europe and get control over it. I think people found it frustrating that until we left the EU, we had absolutely no control over who came and went. We just had complete free movement of people.
Yeah, but there's control, and then there's a destruction of a system, which means that my mum has a carer, that other people get their bed changed at their hotel, that there's a waiter at a restaurant in the evening, that pubs open for breakfast as we've just been hearing. That there is a risk that actually you're making companies really suffer.
Well, I think it certainly will create pressure for higher wages. People may, in some cases, have to pay a bit more in order to get people. But in other cases, they'll choose to invest in machinery, in automation, in higher productivity.
Yeah, machines don't care for people.
Higher wage economy that we're looking for.
Yeah, but forgive me, machines don't care for people.
There's a whole bunch of... there are sectors in which it's all about people. That's absolutely true. It's like the care sector, and in those kind of sectors, it's true. People might have to pay higher wages in order to get staff. But at the moment, we've got record levels of employment in this country. Where we need to improve is to see we have got wages growing. Wages are growing at a fast rate. We want to see them growing even faster. And at the bottom end, yes, you can do things like the new national living wage, which will be one of the highest minimum wages in the world. But for people a bit further up, you want to see faster growth in wages. And yes, if employers do just want to rely on really low wage labour from overseas, that is an option that we want to see them going down a different route. We want to see the investment in people, in skills and in machinery, rather than just more and more coming from overseas. And actually there's an unfairness between different employers, because some people are doing the right thing, they're investing in their people, they're investing in their businesses, but others are effectively kind of free riding by just saying, well, I just need to have endless supply of low-skilled people from the EU. I think this system does strike a balance, actually, because on the one hand, we will continue to have high-skill migration from other countries, and I'm here in Leicester. I have a lot of constituents who are of Indian origin, and at the moment it's this complete unfairness, because they might be really highly skilled, they might be a brain surgeon or whatever, and they have to jump through lots of hoops to come here, but someone who's coming from Eastern Europe or somewhere in the EU doesn't, and that is a fundamental unfairness that you just can't justify.
Sorry, I'm just a bit staggered where you talk about people at the bottom. I mean, these are people, some of whom are getting up, caring for people on a 24-hour basis often, who've come from Eastern Europe, yes, in the last few years, who are now going to lose their jobs that they're having to do at the level of pay that they're having to do it, because over the years councils have had to cut their social budgets. The money isn't there to increase their salaries.
Hang on a second. You said something there. You said that people were going to lose their jobs. No, nobody is going to lose their job. Just to be clear, if you've come here from the EU, you're going to be allowed to stay. The government have a system for allowing people to register to stay here, and overwhelmingly people are doing. Nobody is going to lose their job. That's just factually wrong. What is going to happen is that if you want to just bring in more low-skilled people from the EU, some lower skilled people will still be able to come for shortage occupations, things where we really need them. And in some areas, actually, we're making it easier, like with the new NHS visa. We'll be able to get the people we need for the NHS. But in other fields, we are trying to move away from an economy that's just built on kind of low-wage overseas labour and towards one that's about productivity, higher wages, a different kind of economy. So there is a change, but it's not some kind of disproportionate thing. And I do think, I said that there was an unfairness there at the moment between my constituents who've come, played by the rules and jumped through lots of hoops, and other people who've come from the EU and have not had to do any of those things. And I do think it's impossible to justify that unfairness that we've had in the old system. And in the new system, people get treated on the basis of what they're bringing to this country, their skill level, their employment and so on, rather than just treating them about where they're from. And I do think that is a much fairer system, as well as one that will help us move towards a more productive, high-wage economy.
But is it? Because we've had Sally Gilson from the Freight Transport Association in the last half hour, Kate Nichols, we've just hearing from UK Hospitality, both saying that they're going to be very badly hit by this.
Well, it depends what you mean by badly hit. If by having to pay higher wages you define that as badly hit, I think that's a very strange use of language. Yes, employers in some sectors are going to have carve-outs. For example, there's the seasonal agricultural worker scheme. People on farms will still be able to access people who come here temporarily to pick fruit in the summer because there's a huge bulk of demand in the summer and not so much in the winter. And in other sectors too, I've already mentioned the NHS visa. We're making sure that there is a kind of proportionality to the system and making sure that employers where there are difficult to fill shortages are still able to get the people they need. But on the other hand, there is a little bit of a challenge here to employers. We're not just going to have a completely open door system. We're not going to have uncontrolled migration. There is going to be, as well as an overall reduction in numbers, there's going to be a change in the composition towards a greater proportion of those who come being higher skilled people earning more and fewer of those people being low skilled people potentially competing for accommodation, for jobs with people at the bottom end of the labour market who are the people who feel this much more than people who are on the highest salaries.
But aren't you painting a picture that's at odds with reality? Because we were hearing, as I say, from the Freight Drivers Association. I mean, do you regard an HGV driver as a low-skilled worker? Do you regard someone who's caring for someone 24 hours a day as low-skilled? Because that puts them in a category.
I don't regard an HGV driver as a low-skilled worker, and if people have the ability to speak English, which is one of the new tests in the system, in the new system, if they have a job waiting for them when they come here, and if they're earning a certain amount of money, they will still be able to come. And
well, they won't. That gets them 30 points. It won't.
To say that we want to have, well, it depends what all the other things that they've got in there in the mix. This is a points-based system where there's more than
well,
just
I know.
one,
they won't have a relevant
test.
PhD in a STEM subject. They will not have a job at an appropriate skill level, and they won't have a salary of more than £25,000.
Well, you don't have to have a PhD in the same subject to come to this country. That's not how the system works. But the key point is, what is not realistic is for some people to say, I'm just going to ignore the result of the last election. The government shouldn't implement its manifesto. I'm going to ignore the 2016 referendum. I'm going to ignore the fact that for the last 10 years, every single poll has showed that people want to see migration controlled and the total volume reduced. I just want to keep having access to unlimited, low-skill, low-wage migration as an employer. That actually is not fair to other employers who are doing the right thing, and it's also not fair to people at the bottom end of the labour market who are the people who are having to compete for jobs, for houses, for all kinds of other things with people coming in from other countries. So I think it's just not realistic to say let's not have controls over migration. That's not where the centre of gravity of most people in this country is. People want to see control. They don't want no immigration. They want people who've got skills to come and bring those skills to this country. But they want to see the total amount reduced, and they want to see the balance change towards more highly skilled people and away from the kind of dependence that we've got locked into on bringing in people from other countries rather than investing in our own people in this country. And I also, personally, and I think a lot of people share this, want to see fairness between people who are very highly skilled, who are subject to controls at the moment, and people from within the EU, who, though they might have no more connection to this country, perhaps even less connection to this country, at the moment don't have any of the same checks on them that my constituents are experiencing. So there's a kind of fairness point here, as well as a point about moving to a more productive, higher wage economy.
Yellow Brown, it's good of you to join us. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Yeah, we've been asking you to get in touch with your questions on how the new immigration rules will affect you or your business, which will restrict entry to the UK for low-paid and low-skilled workers from abroad. The new system, it's all about points. People who want to come here will need at least 70 to apply. So how do the points break down? Let's show you. Having a job offer before you apply, that'll get you 20 points. You'll also get a further 20 points if that job is at an appropriate skill level. An additional 20 points will be awarded if you have a £25,000 salary or work in a sector where there's a labour shortage. And speaking English will also be a requirement. That will earn you 10 points. But there'll be no entry to the UK for most people doing what's classed as lower skilled work. That's in restaurants, care homes or food processing plants. Well, I'm joined now by Dennis Kierans from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. A lot of people worried about what's going on. So let's start with some questions. Nick Lester-Davis from Chilham says, my 101-year-old mother is in a care home staffed mainly by low-skilled EU workers. They need more staff and productivity improvements aren't relevant. What will happen after 2021?
Right. Well, care home and care work has been a big and a controversial part of this whole debate, and it makes sense why it affects a lot of people personally. What it does come down to in this sense, though, it is going to be difficult for care work to adapt to this, really, regardless of whether or not care homes could actually afford to pay more to their staff.
These are budgets that have been very badly affected by cuts.
Exactly. They're too low. Even if they could actually bring up salaries, it wouldn't really matter because they are considered to be too low skilled to come into the UK under this system. And that is something that care work homes, the government will have to deal with. Now, there are some other options that can include bringing in non-EU sort of family migrants, people who come here to be with their family. They don't face the same restrictions, so they could begin to rely on that. You could begin to rely on British workers, although that remains to be seen whether or not that will work, as well as youth mobility scheme people, so the sort of the backpacker route that you've heard about, whether or not that's going to be particularly enticing to these temporary migrants remains to be seen as well. So really, the story is not great. We'll have to see what happens, to be honest.
The care issue is a big one, isn't it? I mean,
it is, yes.
And how you can describe someone who looks after an elder person that's low skilled when they show care. Anyway, I'm going to move on.
I'm with you.
I'm not expressing a view. Now, this is Lee Hemlin from Bangor. I'm from the UK. My partner is French and we have a 2-year-old son. We mostly do seasonal work and already struggle as universal credit won't cover her despite being here since 2012. Right. And now he says, will we now have to leave the UK?
Right. Well, this announcement, and this is really important, I think, for viewers out there, this doesn't have to do with people who are already here in the UK. This has to do with people who, after June 2021, come to the country. So for those who are here, European Union citizens and non-citizens, like this doesn't have to really... This is not what they should be concerned about. They should be concerned about is looking into their own settled status or pre-settled status, and that's something that I think everybody should probably.
So the MP I was speaking to earlier, saying people aren't going to lose their jobs as a result of this. He's right.
Essentially, yes. This is the case, that the people that are here don't need to worry about this announcement today. I'm not giving that as legal advice. No,
and lots of people know that if they work for a company that suddenly is having to pay higher wages and then goes out of business, then no job is safe. But
exactly.
Next question. David Dexter from Lincolnshire. How will the new policy affect agriculture and the seasonal workers brought in annually to service it? We've sort of touched on this.
Yeah. Agriculture is an interesting carve-out. So in the government's proposal today, they did say that they would quadruple the seasonal agricultural worker scheme from 2,500 to 10,000. That's a small proportion of those who are estimated to be currently working in agriculture, which is, I think, somewhere over 60,000. So whether or not that's going to be enough is unclear. But again, there is a carve-out for this low-skilled, as it's called, low-skilled temporary work. So there is that. Otherwise, again, it's a bit the same issue as before.
Aidan from Aberdeen. How will this affect EU workers currently living in the UK who would not meet the 70 points needed if they were to come into the country now? He says, my partner is Polish, earns under £22,000 a year, wouldn't have what some might class as a skilled job. However, she is studying.
Right. So for those who are living here already in the UK, European Union citizens who are living here, this again
don't worry about points.
Don't worry about it. This does not. This whole announcement is to do with people who are coming after the June 2021. So after that date, that's for the people who come to the UK after that date. This is what that announcement is all about.
But if I just push that further, if he wanted to bring her, if she wanted to join him after next year, there would be a problem.
So is she already here or not?
She's here at the moment. I'm just extrapolating because the point system, when it does kick in, absolutely they'd have a problem.
Yeah, there are different routes into the UK, and it's unclear how they would go about that. Would she come here on a work visa? Would she try and join him as a family member? Would she's mentioned she's a student. Would she come here as a student? I can't comment on their exact.
Okay, lots of questions. Another one, P from Gloucester, doesn't want to give his first name. I have been working here for nearly 13 years and the hospitality business is one that needs more staff to fill the gaps. Now my biggest question is, what is the government going to do with this shortage of staff? Is hospitality going to have automated jobs, he says?
So, on this point, quite similar to the first point on care work. So these jobs are not going to be eligible to come into the UK in the future system. So the government has said, yes, automation. For some roles within hospitality, it's thought that you could probably do automation, so checking into a hotel and that kind of thing. Other jobs, cleaning rooms, require a lot more of a kind of personal touch. That's going to be harder to fill with, machines, automation, and that kind of thing.
Well, you've already heard from the hospitality industry, and they're very concerned about this.
No, fair enough.
Now, Alessandro Disclavis from Girvan says, I arrived in UK December 2019. I'm working with permanent contract as a food and beverage service manager in a hotel. How will this plan affect me? I mean, you've sort of answered it. Anybody already here is okay.
Should be fine.
So that's the answer to that one. Right, let's move on. From Liverpool, Tassos Ziortsis, I'm a Cypriot third-year law student at the University of Liverpool. What happens to those EU students studying in UK institutions and want to work in the UK after they graduate? So after the implementation of this system.
Right. So what's being proposed is that they'll have 2 years to work a job at any skill level in the UK, after which they'll need an employer to sponsor them to stay on. And so in a way, it may be also this post-study cohort that ends up potentially filling some of these gaps. Again, remains to be seen. But he'll be able to, or people in his situation would be able to stay on for 2 years.
Any system like this works if there's no flexibility, one assumes. I mean, points are points. But do you sense that there will have to be some flexibility introduced on something like this?
Well, yeah, they baked a bit of flexibility into the system. So previously, for non-EU migrants, they had a point system, but all of the points were compulsory. Whereas now you can trade off some attributes. So you still need to speak English, you still need to have a job offer, you still need to meet the salary and skill threshold. But if you have a PhD, it's a little bit easier. You can earn a little bit less. Likewise, if you're in a shortage occupation, as you mentioned at the...
Well, you get points for a PhD, don't you, or a STEM subject?
Which basically means that you can earn a slightly lower salary in that field.
Right, so you play off your points?
You kind of, to a certain degree, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's really good of you. You've cleared up a lot of questions for people. Thank you very much. Dennis Kearns, thank you. Good to see you. The Liberal Democrat Home Affairs spokesperson, Christine Jardine, joins me now from Edinburgh. And is this an acceptable way forward?
No, this Conservative immigration policy is going to be a disaster for so many of the small businesses who are the backbone, the driving force of our economy nowadays. It's going to make it more difficult for them to get the workforce that they need to come to this country. They're going to have to be looking for higher paid workers all the time. And the salary levels, you know, it's valuing what people do in terms of money, not what the value of their actual role is. Roles like vital, nursing, social care, they're not being properly valued in this. It's just not a good, positive way ahead for the country.
Well, you say nursing. I think nursing, a nurse would probably reach the acceptable level of points to get in. But the social care, what the government is saying is that for too long we've been relying on low-paid workers. We need to up the pay and give them what they're worth.
what we have to do is encourage people to come to this country to work in those sectors. And what we have to do is provide, as you just said, a good salary for it. But how are we going to do that? The government doesn't have a plan for doing that. The government isn't saying what is actually going to be required. It talks about appropriate skill levels. It talks about required levels of English. It's all very loose, and it's not what we need. What we need is investment in this country. We need investment in effective border forces. We need to stop people trafficking, and we need to be encouraging the people to come here that our industry needs.
The one thing it isn't is loose, because it's very clear. 20 points if you have a job offer, 10 points if you speak English, 20 points for relevant PhD.
No, if you speak English to the required level. What is the required level? It doesn't say. That's what I'm talking about. It doesn't say exactly what it is. And also, again, it's arbitrary numbers. It's figures on a page. It's not looking at what the country actually needs. It's not looking at what industry actually needs and attracting people. And the salary levels, they're not going to, they're not going to allow people to come here and work in social care because they'll fall below the salary threshold. Nurses get about 25,000 on entry, so it's not going to allow people to come here and start a career as a nurse. It's not looking at what the country needs. It's looking at numbers. It's looking at figures. It's not valuing people for what they bring to the country. And it's not looking, there's no route for low-skilled workers. There's no route for the agricultural sector for workers that we need for fruit picking. It's just not addressing the issues that this country needs addressed.
Well, it's addressing the issues that were raised in the whole Brexit debate, and the government says were raised once again in the last election.
I don't think there's too much that's been made about immigration having been part of the Brexit debate. The problem we're going to have now is that we're stopping freedom of movement, and that this policy will not help to bring the people to this country that we need for the hospitality sector, we need for the health sector, we need for the construction sector. And that is what we should be addressing. These sectors will not be helped by this policy. And we need, small businesses, as I said at the very beginning. How are they going to work with this system, which will force them to, look for higher paid workers, possibly higher than they can afford because they're a small business starting out. Now, it's not looking at what the country needs, it's not valuing people properly, and most importantly, it's not investing in what we need to have a strong border force to stop illegal immigration, which people were genuinely worried about. It's not looking at how we stop people trafficking. It's not talking about providing safe routes for refugees and ensuring that people trafficking doesn't intervene and we don't see more tragedies like we did recently with the Vietnamese workers. These are the things that we need to address. And this immigration policy doesn't do that.
Christine Jardine, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
And we can talk now to our political correspondent Leila Nathu, who's at Westminster. Leila, just picking up on that last point, this is a major overhaul of the system and one that could be economically risky.
Yeah, one that has to be done in a very short time. It's supposed to kick in a little over a year, and businesses have to adjust according to the government. The government has made a distinction between skilled workers and what they call lower skilled workers, and they have prioritised skilled workers. So there is no special provision for lower skilled workers. The definition of skilled has been slightly altered, has been expanded. The salary threshold has come down there. The government is very keen to stress that skilled workers, who they deem skilled workers, are welcome to come. But the route for lower skilled workers has been closed off almost entirely. And as you heard there, certain sectors have been saying that they are going to be short of workers, where they are struggling to recruit. How are businesses who have come to rely on EU workers in the past going to adapt in this very short time? And the government really has put the onus on businesses to say, look, this is up to you now to reform, to have automation, to make technological advances, to train your staff, pay them more. There was some suggestion of recruiting from the economically inactive in the UK population, but certainly this is a big change for businesses, and we've been hearing from different sectors that they're going to have difficulties in adjusting to these new salary thresholds and the new system. How it plays out, we will have to see. The government has said that they intend to reduce overall levels of migration, but really what they are doing with this new policy is changing the composition of migrants who come to the UK.
OK, many thanks. Leila Nathu there, our political correspondent at Westminster.
Back now to our main story today. People who want to come to the UK who are low skilled or low paid won't be able to get a work visa under the government's plans for a new points-based immigration system. It will be introduced in January, and many industries, including the care and hospitality sectors, have warned the plans could have damaging consequences for the economy. Well, joining me now is Alp Mehmet from the Migration Watch UK organisation, which campaigns to reduce immigration, and also joining me from the North East is Bryony Rest, an immigration lawyer with David Gray Solicitors in Newcastle. Thank you both very much for joining us here. Alp Mehmet, let me start with you. So your organisation campaigns to reduce immigration. How far will Priti Patel's proposals go towards achieving that end, do you think?
Well,
in the way that you want it to happen?
She has made a reasonable start by pulling back from some of the proposals that her predecessor put in place. Sajid Javid, just before Christmas 2018, he had a scheme, an idea that low-skilled, no-skilled workers would be able to come in, look for work and stay for less than a year. They've moved away from that, and I welcome that. That's a sensible thing to do. However, what they're also proposing is really having plugged one end, they're opening it up at the other. They're lowering the skill levels required to get a job. Their employers are no longer going to have to advertise. The salary threshold is being reduced to 25,600.
It was 30,000.
It was 30,000. Well, yes, but lots of exceptions, of course. And that really will mean that something like 16 million jobs, all these measures, will expose 16 million jobs in this country to overseas competition. That isn't sensible. And also,
you want to see British people getting those jobs?
I would like to see more training and more preparation, yes. Nothing in the way of preparation has taken place. And that's the fault of employers, really. I would very much like to see the sort of system which not only allows people to come in with the right skills, but also presses employers to train more, because training has fallen through the floor, and we can do a great deal more of that.
OK. Bryony Rest, what do you make of the proposals, and how do you respond to Alp Mehmet?
Well, the proposals really are similar to what we've got already with the skilled work route, but like Alp says, with a slightly lower salary threshold and a slightly lower skills threshold. But these are still skilled jobs. I think there's a lot of concern from many industry areas that have relied on what the government call low-skilled jobs, but possibly they mean low-paid jobs. That who are they going to recruit to replace the EU workers that they can't retain, or perhaps it's seasonal work, for example, that they need workers for certain times of year. How are they going to replace those workers? The difficulty is for these sectors is that these changes are coming in January. They've got 10 months to prepare. And whilst the government have said that more British people should be employed in these jobs, like Alp says, there'll be more training needed. Also, a lot of these jobs, the government say, could be automated, but you can't automate care. You can't automate all fruit picking. These are actually very important jobs in our economy. And I think the government needs to give us more detail about how they expect the British economy and workforce to replace the workers we can't now recruit from Europe.
So Priti Patel does say that there are 8 million plus people who are economically inactive, but it has been pointed out that a lot of them are elderly, or they're carers, or they're students. Who are these people who are going to do this
Well,
work?
there are something like 4 million people who would actually like to do more work and are available for more work and can't. That was an analysis that we did not so long ago.
4 million?
Yes, if not more. Fruit pickers, well, there's already a scheme in place to allow up to 10,000 fruit pickers to come in. They're not really an issue, because fruit pickers will come in, and so long as the scheme is properly run, I don't see any problem in that, because they don't add to net migration.
But they won't be allowed in, will they?
Yes, there is a scheme. The government is going to has introduced a scheme which is now going to be expanded and will allow for 10,000 fruit pickers, seasonal agricultural workers to come in. The other thing is care. Now, a few years ago, I think in 2016, the Migration Advisory Committee said there's no such thing as a shortage of care workers. What you need to do is pay them a little more. pay them a little more and change the conditions. And frankly, that is also something that we could look to first rather than automatically go for the cheaper option.
But that, as you know, requires more money from central government to local government, and local government has been vastly pared back in the last 10 years.
So be it. So be it. I think that
you can't have both. You've got to pay them more.
Well, in the short run, I think that is money well spent, frankly, because what people also forget is that if someone is coming here, they need a roof over their heads. If they're going to live here, their children will want to go to school. They will have cars. So there are added pressures to a population that's increasing by 1 million every 3 years, and that 80% of that the result of migration. That is not sensible.
Bryony Rest, just to pick up on that point that Al Mehmet was making about seasonal agricultural workers, that there are routes in already that are going to be expanded. Is that right?
Yes, there's a scheme currently in place for 10,000 extra workers to come to meet that seasonal need. But the industry says that's just not enough at all. That's not going to replace the workers they've had mainly from the EU that have done those roles. Now, maybe the government are going to expand that, but I think the difficulty we have at the moment is a lack of a lot of detail about how this is actually going to work. And can I pick up on one more point as well about training, is that for the last 4 years, the government have imposed what's called an immigration skills charge on any organisation that's brought in overseas workers, which is supposed to have gone back into a pot to train British workers to take more roles. Now, it obviously hasn't completely worked, and these things take time to filter through. So this is not feasible by next January, that all the workers that are needed to fulfil these places, which are maybe lower skilled jobs in some view, but are still require some skills, it's not enough time to replace the workers and train them up to do the jobs. It's not feasible.
That is a very valid point, isn't it? 10 months is a tiny amount of time.
Well, officials have been working on this for months and months and months.
But businesses haven't.
Well, businesses should have been working on it, frankly. The referendum took place in 2016, in June 2016. Why haven't they been preparing?
Because they didn't know what the plans were going to be.
No, because they didn't expect to come out, frankly. I think they were assuming that somehow everything will be brushed to one side and Brexit wouldn't happen at all. Well, I think if they were sensible, they would looked ahead and planned, at least for the potential of us leaving and having to look for additional workers.
And Bryony Rest, if you could speak to the Home Secretary and address to her your concerns, what would you say to her?
I would say that the current plans don't give enough detail about what businesses need to know. They need to have much longer to prepare for this. They need to have some proper detail in place, and the scheme needs to be much more flexible. For example, I mean, I'm based in Newcastle. The salary thresholds, even the lower ones that are now proposed, it just don't reflect our local economy up here. It might be fine for London, £25,600, but for Newcastle, that's quite a sizable income. So there needs to be some other detail and reflection about how this is going to affect all of the country, not perhaps just the South East.
Really interesting. We're going to have to leave it there. Bryony Rest, Al Mehmet, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.
And Vicky Young joins us now from Westminster. Vicky, I guess this represents a big tick on the government's to-do list.
Yeah, it does, because if you think about the EU referendum, it was all about taking back control. Remember that slogan? And that was a lot of that about immigration, about controlling the UK's borders. So yes, now it's the UK Parliament that will decide who comes here and what they do. So yes, that box is ticked. But when it comes to immigration and whether it's going to go down or rise up or stay the same, that is more uncertain. And that's because it's very clear from the Home Office that this is a flexible system. Yes, it will come into force on the 1st of January, but they are going to keep it under constant review. It means if they want to make changes, if there's a negative impact on the economy, they can do that. So it's the UK government in charge. It also, of course, means that they are accountable for what happens next.
Vicky, thank you very much.
You're watching Beyond 100 Days. If you stop low-skilled foreign workers coming to the UK, will it drive up wages, encourage automation and boost growth?
Well, that's the gamble behind the biggest shake-up of British labour laws in decades.
The government's new immigration plan is a clear response to Brexit, but lots of UK businesses don't really like it. Hello, I'm Catty Kay in Washington. Clive Myrie is in London for us. The UK government has launched a massive experiment in immigration that tries to marry business needs for labour with political demands to put British workers first. The new plan will award visas to the UK on the basis of a foreigner's skills. The government says this will protect British jobs, encourage more automation and attract better educated foreign talent.
But one independent migration group which advises the government says the plan will have zero effect on UK wages and job opportunities. And several UK industries say they rely on low-skilled foreign workers because Britons won't do the jobs.
Under the new scheme, foreigners will need to earn 70 points to apply for a UK visa. Having a job offer before you apply will get you 20 of those points. If that job is at an appropriate skill level, that earns you another 20 points.
If you have a job offer that pays £25,600 or work in a sector where there's a labour shortage, that's another 20 points. Speaking English will also now be a requirement. That gets you 10 points. Now, the changes mean it'll be hard for people to come to the UK to work in lower skilled jobs in restaurants, care homes or food processing plants. Well, the Home Secretary Priti Patel said the changes marked a historic moment for the UK.
This basically redefines our immigration policy. So the brightest and the best, people with skills need to come to the UK, and we will no longer have the routes for cheap, low-skilled labour that obviously has dominated immigration and our labour market for far too long in this country.
So what do the rules mean in practice? Let's take two hypothetical case studies, starting with a university academic who has an offer for a job and wants to move to the UK. As well as speaking English and being suitably qualified, two of the compulsory conditions, she would get points for her science PhD. And those points would be enough to reach 70, the necessary number to get her visa approved.
But now let's look at another example, a waiter from an EU country who's currently free to live and work in the UK. Well, he may meet the basic conditions of having a job offer, speaking English and having school qualifications, but because the job isn't considered a shortage occupation and the salary is lower than £25,600, he won't get 70 points, so he won't be let in. Well, we've been speaking to Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of Hospitality UK, which represents the hospitality sector. There are a lot of people who would say these changes have been a long time coming, you should be preparing for them, and frankly, you lot have been relying too much on cheap migrant labour, which has driven down wages for everybody else.
Well, first of all, there's no evidence that migrant labour has driven down wages. Even the government's own Migration Advisory Committee found that that was not the case. We recruit locally, and it's been local people who've been applying for our jobs, and we've grown exponentially. We created 1 in 8 of all new jobs since the financial crash, 1 in 6 last year, and 75% of our workforce is UK born and bred, and we're investing heavily in upskilling them. The challenge is that we're in an incredibly tight labour market, and the population just isn't there to fill all the vacancies we've got and sustain the levels of growth that we are currently enjoying and delivering benefits to the UK economy.
But low wages have been good for your business, haven't they?
Well, wages have been growing in our sector 6% year on year, and we've been investing heavily in our teams to improve the reward, the recognition and the capacity that they've got. The challenge that we've got around salaries is not the absolute salary level, it's the fact that many of our workers will work part-time or will work flexibly, and the salary thresholds that the government have set are absolute for that job, irrespective of hours worked. That's the challenge we've got with salaries, not that we're a low-pay sector.
Kate, one of the things the government would like to see is more automation in industry rather than low-paid foreign workers taking those jobs. Are there areas of the hospitality industry that could be more automated?
Yes, businesses have invested in automation and AI, particularly around checking in and checking out in hotels. There's a lot more that is an automated process, labour scheduling and back of office functions. But ultimately, hospitality is selling an experience, and that requires skilled people to cook the food, to serve the food, and to provide people with the social environment in which they enjoy themselves and the entertainment that they enjoy across the breadth of hospitality. So there's a limited amount that automation can do to replace those human beings, but ultimately, if we do have restrictions, that's one of the things that we will be looking at, moving towards more self-serve, moving towards grab and go, and not being able to provide that full service offer, which will damage the UK's UK's reputation as the world leading hospitality market, and also mean that we can't create the jobs and the growth and the investment in local communities and high streets.
Kate, can we talk about Scotland, because there's been a particular outcry today from Scotland. 1 in 12 jobs in Scotland is in the tourism sector. I think it's something like 40,000 workers in Scotland are actually foreign, perhaps low-skilled workers. Can they be replaced by local labour?
Not readily. I mean, you are talking about quite rural communities in a lot of Scottish towns and cities and rural areas where tourism is the main employer in the sector. And Scotland, like England, has seen a decline in the birth rate. We've got 200,000 fewer UK-born 18 to 24-year-olds entering the jobs market this year. And we've got almost full employment in those tourism-heavy sectors. There simply aren't the UK workers available, and in Scotland in particular that's even more acute. As a lot of Scots have moved away, they don't have that indigenous population to take up the slack in these critical areas.
OK, let's talk now to Heather Rolfe, Head of Research at the Demos think tank. She's with me here in the studio. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. Some have suggested that this goes beyond controlling immigration, which is what a lot of people said they wanted in the 2016 Brexit referendum. It's actually about restricting immigration, which are two different things and could affect the economy.
Absolutely. So it does go way beyond control. So one of the aims is to reduce numbers. But this policy will specifically reduce the number of lower skilled workers in some of the key sectors, one of which Kate mentioned, hospitality, but the other ones include food processing and social care, which will find it very difficult to recruit replacements for the migrants who have fed those sectors for a number of years.
And some people have shown disquiet about a potential linking between low-skilled work and low-paid work. And that has caused a lot of issues today.
It has. I mean, some people are concerned about that. I mean, but one of the requirements is that the job should be at NVQ level 3, roughly equivalent to A level, and that's a requirement. So even if a job was paid more, actually it has to be at that level. But I think where the mistake is in terms of this policy, I think it's built on the government's assessment of public attitudes, and the public consistently does favour more highly skilled migration over lower skilled, but the public still recognises the need for lower skilled labour in sectors like social care, construction, food and drink. They recognise it. So I think this is a misreading, really, of what the public wants around immigration.
Heather, one of the arguments is that you would raise jobs for British workers because if there aren't the foreigners to do them, if you want people to pick your fruit, or if you are a hotel that needs somebody to clean those hotel rooms, you're going to have to boost wages in order to attract Brits to do those jobs that they don't want to do at the moment. How much would wages have to rise by to replace those low-skilled foreign workers with British workers?
I think, first of all, there's a question of how many workers are available. So the Home Secretary has talked about 8.4 million people being available. But actually, when you unpick that, that includes students, it includes people who are too sick to work, and it includes people who've retired under the age of 65. Unemployment is at its lowest level in the UK, and economic participation is at its highest level. So where these workers are is a problem. So undoubtedly, if you increase the wages in some of these sectors, they would be more attractive, but pay isn't the only factor, as I think Katie from UK Hospitality pointed out, in that it's also the conditions of work, it's the requirement for flexible working. In sectors such as food production, it's the nature of working on a cold factory floor. In care work, there's all issues around the conditions of the job. So it really isn't just pay. And I think you also have to bear in mind that any increase in wages will have to be passed on to the customer, who then will see the value of their own wages eroded. But it really isn't just about pay as a barrier to British people doing lower skilled and lower paid jobs.
OK, Heather Rolfe from Demos, thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Clive, look, this is clearly something that people talk about a lot here in the United States as well. Immigration is a big issue everywhere. And when you do polling on immigration, actually people's attitudes are more nuanced than people might have assumed from the Brexit result, aren't they?
Yeah, it's not black and white. Attitudes towards migration have gone up and down over the last few years. Let's just look at a chart here, you see a high watermark there of antipathy towards migrants, inward migration, around about 2010, 2011. But look how that has fallen, going down beyond 2016 to a point where now almost 50% of the population here in the UK believe inward migration is actually good for the economy and for the country.
Clive, one question might be, has that flip happened there that you can see on that graph just around 2016 at the time of the referendum happened because of the referendum? Did people's attitudes become more positive because they felt their borders were going to be more secure, I guess?
Yeah, a couple of things, I think. First of all, there was a debate about immigration. The ins and outs of it, the rights and wrongs of it, whether it was good for the economy, whether it was not. There was a proper debate. People could base their opinions on facts. And if you remember that graphic there, the high watermark of antipathy was around about 2010, 2011. That was when austerity kicked in this country. And of course, the criticism of migration into this country was that it was affecting services, the NHS, and so on and so forth, putting pressure on those services. Well, actually, it may well have been austerity that was putting that pressure on those services and not migration at all.
Interesting point. Really good to look at those things.